I spent 3 days alone in the African wilderness, with nothing but a broken satellite phone, and the growing realization that my 15-year marriage was built on lies. When that helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, the look of absolute terror on Derek's face made every terrifying night worth it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The helicopter ride back to Nairobi felt like traveling through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Zara Mitchell sat across from me in the aircraft's cabin, her expensive camera equipment secured beside her, occasionally glancing in my direction with what I could only describe as curious satisfaction. She looked exactly like the type of woman Derek had always claimed wasn't his type. Young and conventionally beautiful in a way that required constant maintenance and professional photography to sustain. Dr. Harper sat beside me, occasionally placing a steadying hand on my arm as I scrolled through more of Derek's social media posts on her tablet. Each image felt like a physical blow. Derek and Zara at the Fairmont's infinity pool. Derek and Zara at the hotel's restaurant, clearly celebrating something significant. Derek and Zara on what appeared to be a hot air balloon ride over Mount Kenya, both wearing matching expedition gear that looked far more expensive than anything he'd ever purchased for our family trips. But it was the timestamps that made everything worse. The hot air balloon photos were taken the morning after I'd left for the monitoring station. While I was documenting elephant behavior and Ben was discovering our sabotaged communication equipment, Derek was proposing to another woman with a view of Kenya's highest peaks spread below them. Nicole leaned forward from her seat near the cockpit, her expression mixing professional concern with personal fury. "Maya, I need you to focus on what I'm about to tell you. When Robert called Wild Hearts about your missing team, I started making some calls of my own. Derek's story about a family emergency doesn't match anything his law firm knows about." I looked up from the tablet, my mind struggling to process yet another layer of deception. "What do you mean?" I called his office in Nairobi, claiming to be handling logistics for a family crisis, Nicole continued. His assistant, Patricia, was confused. She said Derek had requested vacation time through the end of the month, specifically mentioning that he was planning something special for your anniversary and didn't want any work interruptions. The helicopter banked slightly as Kibo adjusted our flight path toward Wilson Airport, and through the window I could see the sprawling lights of Nairobi growing larger in the darkness. In less than an hour I would be back in the city where Derek and I had built our life together, but everything I thought I knew about that life was crumbling with each new revelation. Dr. Harper retrieved another device from her bag, this one a laptop that she balanced carefully on her knees as she opened it. "Maya, I need to show you something else." When Nicole told me about Derek's inconsistencies, I decided to review Wild Heart's financial records more carefully. She turned the screen toward me, displaying what appeared to be a detailed spreadsheet tracking donations and expenses over the past year. My foundation's finances were always transparent, a requirement for maintaining our international nonprofit status, but I typically left the detailed bookkeeping to our professional accounting firm. "Look at these consulting fees," Dr. Harper said, highlighting a series of entries that showed monthly payments to something called Mitchell Environmental Photography Services. The amounts were substantial, each payment equivalent to what we normally spent on helicopter fuel for an entire month. "I don't recognize that vendor," I said, though the name Mitchell was making my stomach clench with recognition. "Because you never approved these payments," Dr. Harper replied grimly. "Derek has been authorizing them using his emergency access to the foundation's accounts. Access that was supposed to be limited to genuine emergencies while you were in the field." Zara shifted in her seat, and for the first time since boarding the helicopter, she spoke directly to me. "He told me you'd asked him to handle my contract personally. He said you were too busy with research to deal with administrative details." Her voice carried a slight accent that I couldn't place, and her tone was matter-of-fact rather than apologetic. She was stating information, not seeking forgiveness or expressing regret. "How long have you been receiving payments from my foundation?" I asked, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. 8 months, Zara replied. Derek said Wild Hearts needed a photographer to document conservation successes for fundraising materials. He hired me to follow various projects across Kenya and Tanzania. Nicole pulled out her own phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a photo gallery. Except there are no conservation project photos in Wildheart's recent promotional materials. I checked every publication, website update, and social media post from the past 8 months. Nothing. She handed me her phone, which displayed a series of professional photographs that were undeniably beautiful but had nothing to do with wildlife conservation. Instead, they showed Derek in various locations across East Africa, always impeccably dressed, always looking confident and successful. There were photos of him at expensive restaurants in Nairobi, at luxury lodges in the Masai Mara, at beachfront resorts in Zanzibar. These are all from Zara's professional portfolio, Nicole explained. She's been documenting Derek's life, not conservation work. And your foundation has been paying her nearly $1,000 per month to do it. The math was staggering. Over 8 months, Derek had diverted almost $10,000 from Wild Hearts to create what amounted to a professional photojournal of his affair. Money that was supposed to protect endangered species had instead funded glamorous documentation of his betrayal. But even as the financial implications sank in, I found myself focused on something else entirely. Zara, how many of these photo sessions did Derek arrange? She considered the question carefully, as if mentally reviewing her calendar. Weekly, sometimes twice a week. He said it was important to capture his work from multiple angles, for different types of publications. And he never mentioned me during these sessions? Never talked about his wife or family? Zara's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of discomfort I'd seen from her. He said his marriage was complicated, that you'd grown apart over the years, that you were more interested in animals than in him. He said you'd both agreed the relationship had run its course, but were staying together for the children. The casual way she delivered this fiction made it clear that Derek had been constructing an elaborate alternative reality for months. In Zara's version of events, I was a career-obsessed woman who had essentially abandoned her marriage, leaving Derek lonely and emotionally available. She probably saw herself as rescuing him from an unfulfilling relationship, rather than breaking up a family. Dr. Harper closed her laptop and leaned back in her seat, her expression thoughtful. Maya, there's something else we need to discuss. The timing of this wilderness expedition wasn't random. Derek specifically requested that Robert arrange research opportunities during your stay at Acacia Ridge. I turned to look at her more directly. What do you mean? I called Robert after we discovered Derek's deception. He said Derek had contacted him several weeks ago, claiming that you'd been feeling disconnected from fieldwork and would appreciate the chance to participate in active research during your anniversary trip. Derek suggested the elephant monitoring station specifically, saying you'd mentioned it in conversation. Another carefully constructed lie. I'd never heard of elephant monitoring post number 7 until Ben invited me to join his expedition. Derek had researched my professional interests thoroughly enough to know exactly what kind of opportunity would be irresistible to me, then arranged for it to be offered at precisely the right moment. He planned everything, I said, more to myself than to the others. The romantic anniversary trip, the research expedition, the communication breakdown, even the timing of his social media posts. Kibo's voice came through the helicopter's intercom system. 5 minutes to Wilson Airport. Maya, do you want us to take you home, or would you prefer to go somewhere else first? The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. Home meant the house Derek and I shared in Nairobi's Karen suburb, the space where we'd raised our children and built what I'd believed was a genuine partnership. I wasn't ready to face that environment with everything I'd learned in the past few hours. Actually, Nicole said before I could respond, I think Maya should come to my place tonight. We have a lot more work to do, and she'll need privacy to process everything. As the helicopter touched down at Wilson Airport, I found myself grateful for Nicole's decisiveness. Her house in Westlands was neutral territory, a place where I could think clearly without being surrounded by reminders of my failed marriage. But first, there was something I needed to understand. As we waited for the helicopter's rotors to wind down, I turned to face Zara directly. Why are you here? I asked. Why did you come on this rescue mission instead of staying with Derek? Zara's answer was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used throughout our conversation. Because Derek told me you were probably dead, and I wanted to see for myself whether that was true. The casual brutality of her response left me speechless. She hadn't come to help with my rescue, or to confess her role in Derek's deception. She'd come to confirm my death, to witness the success of the plan that would clear the path for her relationship with my husband. Nicole helped me out of the helicopter while Dr. Harper gathered our equipment and documentation. Zara remained seated until the last moment, finally emerging with her camera gear and an expression of mild disappointment, as if the evening hadn't provided the entertainment she'd expected. "Maya," she said as we prepared to separate outside the airport terminal, "for what it's worth, Derek really did love you once. He showed me your wedding photos, talked about how passionate and dedicated you were when you first started the foundation. He just said that passion never included him anymore." The comment was clearly intended as some form of consolation, but it felt like another violation. Derek had shared our most intimate memories with this woman, probably using our early happiness to justify his current betrayal. Our wedding photos, our private moments, our struggles to build something meaningful together, all reduced to supporting evidence for his narrative of neglect and abandonment. Nicole's house in Westlands was exactly what I needed, a modern space with clean lines and minimal decoration that allowed me to focus without emotional distractions. She'd prepared the guest room with fresh sheets and a selection of comfortable clothes in my size, evidence that she'd been planning this intervention even before my rescue became necessary. "I've been worried about you for months," Nicole admitted as she made tea in her kitchen. "Derek's been isolating you gradually, making you doubt your own perceptions. Classic manipulation tactics." She was right, though I'd been too close to the situation to recognize the pattern. Derek's increasing criticism of my work schedule, his suggestions that I was becoming obsessed with the foundation at the expense of our family, his gentle but persistent comments about how I'd changed since the early days of our marriage. All delivered with apparent love and concern, but designed to make me question my own priorities and judgment. "I kept a folder," Nicole continued, retrieving a thick manila envelope from her desk drawer. "Every time you called me confused about something Derek had said or done, every time you asked whether you were being unreasonable or oversensitive, I wrote it down." She spread the contents of the folder across her dining room table, revealing months of notes written in her precise handwriting. The documentation was extensive and damning. Derek's gradual escalation of criticism, his increasing absence from family events with increasingly elaborate excuses, his tendency to undermine my confidence in small but consistent ways. "Look at this pattern," Nicole said, pointing to entries from 3 months ago. "He started suggesting that you were working too much, right around the time Zara's." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Payments began appearing in the foundation's accounts. He was creating justification for your eventual abandonment, while simultaneously funding his alternative relationship. I studied the timeline Nicole had constructed, seeing my marriage's destruction laid out in clinical detail. Each entry represented a moment when I'd felt confused or hurt by Derek's behavior, but had chosen to give him the benefit of the doubt. Each conversation where I'd questioned my own reactions instead of trusting my instincts. "The weekend he claimed to be at that environmental law conference in Cape Town," Nicole continued, "I called the conference organizers to confirm his participation. He wasn't registered for any panels, wasn't listed as an attendee, and hadn't submitted any presentations." She showed me printed emails and registration records that proved Derek's supposed business trip was entirely fictional. While he'd told me he was delivering a keynote address on wildlife trafficking legislation, he'd actually been nowhere near Cape Town. The credit card records Nicole had somehow obtained showed charges at luxury accommodations throughout Kenya during the same weekend. "How did you get his financial information?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Nicole's smile was grim. "Derek's been using the foundation's legal services for his personal banking. Officially, I'm the attorney of record for several of his accounts. He never removed my access when he opened his newest credit cards. Probably because he forgot I had it." She pulled out another set of documents, these showing a pattern of expenses that painted a detailed picture of Derek's double life. Regular charges at expensive restaurants on evenings when he'd claimed to be working late. Hotel bookings for luxury accommodations in locations he'd never mentioned visiting. jewelry purchases that had never appeared in our household. This bracelet, Nicole said, pointing to a receipt from a high-end jeweler in Nairobi's Sarit Center, cost more than you spent on your entire foundation office renovation last year. The receipt was dated 6 weeks ago, around the time Derek had given me what he'd claimed was a spontaneous gift to celebrate our upcoming anniversary. Except the real gift had gone to Zara, while I'd received something far less expensive from the same jeweler, probably purchased as an afterthought to maintain his cover story. There's more, Nicole said, retrieving her laptop. I've been monitoring Derek's digital footprint since you left for Acacia Ridge. His social media activity, his email patterns, even his GPS location data from the family sharing app you thought was just for safety. She opened a mapping application that showed Derek's movements over the past week. Instead of the simple route from Nairobi to Acacia Ridge and back that he'd described to me, the GPS data revealed a complex pattern of travel throughout central Kenya. He did go to Acacia Ridge, Nicole explained, but only long enough to confirm that you'd left for the monitoring station. Then he drove directly to Nanyuki, checked into the Fairmont under a reservation he'd made weeks in advance, and spent the next 3 days with Zara. The mapping data was precise and damning. I could see exactly when Derek had arrived at each location, how long he'd stayed, and where he'd gone next. While I'd been sleeping on a thin camp mattress and rationing emergency food supplies, Derek had been enjoying spa treatments and gourmet meals 70 kilometers away. But this is the most interesting part, Nicole continued, zooming in on a specific area of the map. Look at Derek's GPS location on the morning your satellite phone stopped working. The data showed Derek's phone signal appearing near the base of the hills surrounding the Kimani Conservancy, in an area that would have provided clear line-of-sight access to the monitoring station where my team was working. He could have used a signal jammer from that position, Nicole explained, basic equipment that would disable GPS and satellite communication within a radius of several kilometers. Equipment that someone with Derek's legal contacts could easily obtain under the guise of corporate security testing. The implication was staggering. Derek hadn't just planned my abandonment, he'd actively sabotaged my ability to call for help. He'd driven to a remote hilltop in the early morning darkness, used electronic equipment to cut off my communication with the outside world, then returned to his luxury hotel to celebrate with his girlfriend. How long? I asked quietly. How long do you think he's been planning this? Nicole was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the documentation spread across her table. Based on the financial evidence, at least 8 months. But I suspect the emotional withdrawal started even earlier. Maybe a year, maybe longer. She showed me bank records that revealed Derek had opened several new accounts without my knowledge, slowly transferring money from our joint investments into accounts I couldn't access. The amounts were significant but not large enough to trigger automatic alerts from our financial management company. He's been preparing for a divorce, Nicole explained. Moving assets, establishing separate credit lines, creating financial independence. But the amounts he's transferred wouldn't support a standard settlement under Kenyan divorce law. The implication was clear. Derek hadn't been planning a conventional divorce where assets would be divided equitably. He'd been planning for my disappearance, permanent and complete, which would leave him free to claim everything we'd built together without any legal complications. My phone, which had been silent since my rescue, suddenly buzzed with an incoming call. Derek's name appeared on the screen, accompanied by the smiling photo I'd taken of him during a family vacation to Zanzibar the previous year. The image now looked like evidence from someone else's life, a document from a marriage that had never been real. Don't answer it, Nicole advised. Let him wonder what you know and when you're going to act on it. But as the phone continued ringing, I found myself curious about what Derek would say. Would he maintain his facade of concern? Would he express relief at my safety? Would he attempt to explain his absence from Acacia Ridge? The call went to voicemail, and within seconds Derek was calling again. Then again. By the time Nicole and I finished reviewing the financial documents, my phone showed 15 missed calls and several text messages. Where are you? Read the first message. Robert said you never returned from the research station. I'm driving back to Kimani now to help with the search. The second message, sent an hour later, showed growing desperation. Please call me as soon as you get this. I'm terrified something's happened to you. But it was the third message that revealed Derek's growing awareness that his plan had failed. I just spoke to Robert again. He said a helicopter from your foundation rescued you hours ago. Why haven't you called me? I've been sick with worry. Nicole and I looked at each other across the table, covered with evidence of Derek's betrayal. His messages painted him as a concerned husband, desperately searching for his missing wife, but we both knew he'd spent the evening celebrating at a luxury resort, while believing I was stranded without communication in one of Kenya's most remote locations. He's good, Nicole observed. If we didn't have this documentation, his performance would be completely convincing. My phone buzzed with another message. Maya, please. Whatever you think you know, let me explain. I love you. I've always loved you. Come home so we can talk. The word explain suggested Derek was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed deception was unraveling. But his continued protestations of love felt like insults after everything I'd discovered in the past few hours. What do we do now? I asked Nicole. She gathered the financial documents and began organizing them into neat stacks. Now we build a case. Derek thinks he's been clever, but he's left a trail of evidence that any competent attorney could use to destroy him in court. I don't want this to go to court, I said quickly. I just want him gone from my life. Nicole's expression was understanding but firm. Maya, Derek didn't just cheat on you. He stole money from your foundation, endangered your life, and attempted to fake your death for financial gain. This isn't about your marriage anymore. This is about criminal behavior that affects everyone who depends on Wild Hearts for protection. She was right, though the implications were overwhelming. Derek's betrayal extended far beyond our personal relationship. The money he'd diverted from the foundation was supposed to fund anti-poaching operations, helicopter rescues, and community education programs. Every dollar he'd spent on Zara's photography sessions was a dollar that couldn't be used to protect endangered wildlife. There's something else you need to consider, Nicole continued. Derek's access to the foundation's accounts, his knowledge of your research schedules, his connections in the legal community. He could cause significant damage to Wild Hearts if he realizes you're planning to expose him. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but Nicole was absolutely right. Derek knew every detail of the foundation's operations, from our banking procedures to our government contracts. If he felt cornered, he could use that knowledge to create problems that would take years to resolve. So what do you suggest? I asked. Nicole's smile reminded me of why she'd been so successful as a corporate attorney before transitioning to nonprofit work. We use Derek's own tactics against him. We plan carefully, we gather irrefutable evidence, and we strike at the moment when he's most vulnerable. She opened her laptop and began pulling up additional documents. I've already started the process. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing paperwork to freeze all of Wild Hearts' accounts that Derek has access to. I'm also requesting a forensic audit of every transaction he's authorized over the past year. The plan was methodical and comprehensive. Nicole had already contacted Dr. Harper about calling an emergency board meeting to address Derek's unauthorized use of foundation funds. She'd prepared documentation for the Kenya Wildlife Service about Derek's possible involvement in sabotaging communication equipment in a protected area. She'd even researched precedents for criminal charges related to spouse abandonment and endangerment. But the most important thing, Nicole emphasized, is that Derek can't know what we're planning until everything is in place. He needs to believe that his deception is still working, that you're still the confused and isolated woman he's been manipulating for months. As midnight approached and exhaustion finally began to overtake my adrenaline, I found myself thinking about Lily and Sam. They were safe in Cape Town with Derek's parents, but they would need to know something about what was happening. I couldn't let them discover their father's betrayal through social media or gossip from other families. I need to call the kids, I told Nicole. Not tonight, she replied firmly. Tonight you process everything you've learned. Tomorrow we start fighting back. She was right, but as I lay in her guest room staring at the ceiling, my mind raced through everything I'd discovered. The financial theft, the elaborate deception, the calculated abandonment, the celebration of what Derek had believed was my death. Each revelation felt like a physical blow, but underneath the pain, something else was growing. Anger. Cold, focused, strategic anger that reminded me why I'd been successful in building Wild Hearts from nothing into one of East Africa's most respected conservation organizations. I'd spent 15 years rescuing animals from dangerous situations. Now I was going to rescue myself from the most dangerous predator I'd ever encountered, my husband. My name is Maya Chen, and until 3 months ago, I thought I was living the dream life. At 38, I had built Wild Hearts Conservation Foundation from nothing into one of East Africa's most respected wildlife protection organizations. Our helicopter rescue operations had saved countless animals from poachers, our anti-trafficking work had made international headlines, and our research stations across Kenya were gathering data that was changing how the world understood elephant migration patterns. I had everything I thought I wanted: a successful career that mattered, 2 incredible teenagers who still actually wanted to spend time with me, and Derek Williams, the man I'd fallen in love with during my graduate studies at UC Berkeley. Back then, he was charming, supportive of my dreams, and claimed he wanted nothing more than to build a life with someone who was making a real difference in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my professional life rescuing animals, yet I couldn't see that I was the one who needed saving. Derek was a corporate attorney specializing in international environmental law, or at least that's what his business cards claimed. His firm had offices in Nairobi, San Francisco, and London, and he spent weeks at a time traveling between them, supposedly negotiating contracts for renewable energy projects across Africa. I was proud of him, proud of us, proud of the power couple narrative we'd crafted, where we were both fighting for the planet in our own ways. The kids, Lily and Sam, had grown up splitting their time between Nairobi's international school and the conservancy where my foundation operated. They spoke Swahili as fluently as English, could identify animal tracks better than most trained guides, and had passport stamps from a dozen countries where Derek's work had taken our family on business trips that doubled as vacations. Our life looked perfect on paper. Our Nairobi home was featured in Architectural Digest as an example of sustainable luxury living. Our annual Christmas cards showed us smiling in matching khaki, surrounded by rescued elephants at our sanctuary. Derek's law firm's website still features a photo of him presenting a check to Wild Hearts, with me accepting it in front of our helicopter. The photograph that would later make me sick to look at. For months leading up to our anniversary trip, Derek had been different. More attentive, more romantic, constantly talking about how we needed to reconnect as a couple now that the kids were older and more independent. He planned everything himself, insisting it would be a surprise, a second honeymoon to celebrate 15 years of marriage and my foundation's recent expansion into Tanzania. "You work too hard," he'd say, pulling me away from my laptop where I was reviewing elephant tracking data or approving helicopter maintenance schedules. "When's the last time we just enjoyed the wildlife instead of constantly trying to save it?" He booked us a week at Acacia Ridge Lodge, one of Kenya's most exclusive eco-luxury destinations, located deep within the Kimani Wildlife Conservancy. The conservancy was a 50,000-acre private reserve in northern Kenya, home to some of the continent's largest elephant herds and most endangered species. It was also completely isolated, requiring a 4-hour drive from Nanyuki over rough terrain, or a helicopter flight that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Just the 2 of us," Derek promised as he showed me the booking confirmation on his phone. "No foundation emergencies, no work calls, no distractions." The lodge manager is an old friend of mine from law school, Robert Nyong'o. He's promised to take personal care of us. I was touched by the gesture, especially since Derek had been working longer hours than usual, often not returning home until well past midnight, claiming his firm was handling a massive contract dispute for a South African mining company. The strain was showing on both of us. We'd been functioning more like business partners than spouses, coordinating schedules and managing household logistics, but rarely connecting on anything deeper. The morning we left for Kimani, Derek was practically vibrating with excitement. He loaded our luggage into his Range Rover with unusual enthusiasm, double-checking that we had everything we needed for a week in the wilderness. He'd even packed a cooler with my favorite foods, knowing that lodge cuisine, however gourmet, could become repetitive over a long stay. "This is going to be perfect," he kept saying as we drove through Nairobi's chaotic morning traffic. "Exactly what we both need." Lily and Sam were spending the week with Derek's parents in Cape Town, a trip they'd been looking forward to for months. His mother had planned a full itinerary of museums, whale watching, and visits to historical sites. The kids were excited, Derek seemed thrilled, and I was grateful for the chance to focus solely on my marriage, without the constant demands of work and parenting. The drive to Kimani took us through some of Kenya's most spectacular landscapes. We passed Mount Kenya's snow-capped peaks, wound through highland forests where colobus monkeys chattered in the canopy above, and eventually descended into the vast semi-arid plains where giraffes moved like gentle giants across the horizon. Derek was the perfect travel companion, stopping frequently for photos, sharing stories about his previous visits to the region for work, and asking thoughtful questions about the conservation challenges facing each ecosystem we passed through. "I never get tired of this," I told him as we watched a herd of zebras cross the road in front of us, their stripes shimmering in the afternoon heat. "Neither do I," he replied, but something in his voice made me glance at him. His expression was strange, almost melancholy, as if he was seeing the landscape for the last time. We arrived at Acacia Ridge just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the acacia trees in shades of gold and amber that gave the lodge its name. The entrance was marked only by a small wooden sign and a dirt track that wound through thick bush for several kilometers, before opening into a clearing where the lodge's main buildings nestled among ancient fever trees. Robert Nyong'o met us at reception, with the kind of warm professionalism that made Acacia Ridge famous among international travelers. He was tall, elegant, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades managing luxury properties in remote locations. His smile was genuine as he embraced Derek like an old friend and welcomed me with the respectful enthusiasm reserved for VIP guests. "Maya, it's such an honor," Robert said as he personally escorted us to our tent. "Derek has told me so much about your work with Wild Hearts. We've actually used your helicopter services twice for emergency animal rescues. Your pilots are legends among the Conservancy staff. Our accommodation was breathtaking. The luxury tent was more like a permanent pavilion, with hardwood floors, a massive four-poster bed draped in mosquito netting, and a private deck that overlooked a waterhole where elephants came to drink each evening. The bathroom featured both indoor and outdoor showers, and the sitting area was equipped with comfortable furniture and a well-stocked bar." "This is incredible," I told Derek as we stood on our deck, watching a small herd of elephants approach the waterhole below. "Thank you for planning all this." He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Anything for you," he murmured, but again there was something in his tone that felt off, almost like he was delivering lines from a script. That first evening was magical in every way I'd hoped it would be. We had dinner on the main lodge's terrace under a canopy of stars brighter than anything visible in Nairobi. The food was exceptional, the wine flowed freely, and Derek was charming and attentive in ways that reminded me of our early dating days. He asked about my latest research, listened intently as I described our new anti-poaching strategies, and shared stories about his recent travels that had me laughing until my sides hurt. "To 15 years, he said, raising his glass as the night sounds of the African bush created a symphony around us. "To 15 more, I replied, clinking my glass against his. We made love that night with a passion that had been missing from our relationship for months. Afterward, as Derek slept beside me, I lay awake listening to the distant roar of lions and feeling more optimistic about our marriage than I had in years. Maybe all we'd needed was this space away from our daily responsibilities to remember why we'd fallen in love in the first place. The next 2 days followed a perfect rhythm. Early morning game drives where we spotted leopards, lions, and massive elephant bulls. Leisurely afternoons by the pool where Derek worked on his laptop while I read books I'd been meaning to get to for months. Evening walks around the lodge's perimeter where we identified bird species and talked about everything and nothing. Derek seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He laughed easily, took hundreds of photos, and repeatedly told me how much he loved me. The only odd note was his insistence on taking selfies constantly, more than he'd ever done before. He wanted photos of us at breakfast, during our game drives, relaxing by our tent, even just walking to dinner. "For the kids," he'd say when I teased him about his sudden photography obsession. They'll want to see everything. On our third morning, Robert approached our table during breakfast with what appeared to be exciting news. "Maya, I have a special opportunity for you," he announced, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Our head ranger, Ben Okoye, is leading a research expedition to one of our remote monitoring stations today. They're tracking a matriarchal elephant herd that's been displaying unusual migration patterns. Given your expertise, he'd be honored to have you join the team." I looked at Derek, expecting him to show interest or at least ask questions about the expedition. Instead, he immediately began shaking his head. "Honey, we're supposed to be relaxing," he said, reaching for my hand across the table. "Can't you take a break from work for just 1 week?" But Robert's description had already captured my imagination. "It's exactly the kind of behavioral data we've been trying to collect at Wild Hearts," I explained to Derek. "This could be incredibly valuable for our research." "How long would the expedition take?" Derek asked Robert, and I noticed his tone had shifted from concerned husband to something more calculating. "The station is about 2 hours hike from here, through some of our most pristine wilderness," Robert explained. "The team will spend the day collecting data and return before sunset. Maya would be back in time for dinner." Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the waterhole where a lone elephant was drinking in the morning light. Finally, he smiled. But it was different from the warm expressions he'd been wearing all week. "You know what? You're right," he said. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You should absolutely go." Something in his sudden change of heart made me pause. "You don't mind spending the day alone?" "I have work to catch up on anyway," Derek replied. "Besides, this is what you're passionate about. I want you to follow that passion." The research team consisted of Ben Okoye, 2 junior rangers, and a graduate student from the University of Nairobi who was collecting data for her thesis on elephant communication patterns. They were prepared for a full day in the field with GPS equipment, cameras, notebooks, and enough water and food for 12 hours away from the lodge. As we prepared to leave, Derek was unusually affectionate. He kissed me longer than necessary, held my hand tightly, and made me promise to be careful. "I love you so much," he said, pulling me close. "More than you'll ever know." "I love you too," I replied, touched by his emotion. "It's just 1 day." The hike to Elephant Monitoring Post number 7 was everything Ben had promised. We moved through landscapes that few humans ever experienced, following ancient elephant paths through thick acacia forests and across open plains where every footstep revealed new wonders. Buffalo watched us from the shade of fever trees, giraffes observed our passage with curious dignity, and countless bird species filled the air with their calls. The monitoring station itself was a simple structure designed to have minimal impact on the surrounding ecosystem. Solar panels powered basic equipment for recording and transmitting data, while the shelter consisted of little more than a raised platform with a corrugated metal roof and canvas walls that could be opened or closed depending on weather conditions. The work was fascinating. The elephant herd Ben's team was studying consisted of nearly 30 individuals, led by an ancient matriarch whose ivory was so massive that poachers had been tracking her for years. Our helicopter pilots had provided protection during several attempted attacks, and seeing her in her natural habitat, leading her family with the wisdom of decades, was profoundly moving. We spent hours documenting behavior, recording vocalizations, and mapping movement patterns. The graduate student, a brilliant young woman named Ruth, was particularly excited about the infrasonic communication she was capturing on her specialized equipment. "They're talking to other herds more than 50 kilometers away," she explained as we watched the elephants through binoculars. "The matriarch is sharing information about water sources, safe routes, even warning about human activity." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself completely absorbed in the work. This was why I dedicated my life to conservation, these moments when scientific discovery merged with profound respect for the intelligence and complexity of the animals we were trying to protect. It was Ben who first noticed something was wrong. "The satellite phone isn't working," he announced during our late afternoon break. He'd been trying to check in with the lodge, a standard safety protocol for teams working in remote locations. We tried everything. Different positions, fresh batteries, various troubleshooting techniques Ben had learned during his 15 years as a head ranger. Nothing worked. The device was completely dead, despite showing full battery charge that morning. Probably just interference, Ruth suggested. These older units can be finicky. But Ben's expression was troubled. I've never seen one fail completely like this. Even with interference, we should get some signal. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ben made the decision I'd been dreading. We need to stay overnight, he announced. It's not safe to navigate back to the lodge in darkness, especially without communication. We'll head back first thing in the morning. The monitoring station was equipped for overnight stays, with sleeping bags, emergency food supplies, and water purification tablets. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't dangerous either. The main concern was letting the lodge know we were safe, but Ben assured us that missing communications for one night wasn't unusual in the field. Robert will know where we are, he said. He's been managing expeditions like this for 20 years. As night fell and the sounds of the African bush intensified around us, I found myself thinking about Derek. He'd be worried when we didn't return for dinner. I imagined him pacing our tent's deck, watching for our headlights on the road back to the lodge. I had no way of knowing that Derek wasn't worried at all. That at that exact moment he was raising a champagne glass in celebration, 70 kilometers away, in a luxury hotel room in Nanyuki, with a woman I'd never heard of but whose name would soon become permanently etched in my memory. The next morning, Ben tried the satellite phone again with the same result. Complete silence. He made the decision to send the 2 junior rangers back to the lodge on foot while he, Ruth and I remained at the station to continue the research and wait for rescue. They'll reach Acacia Ridge by noon, Ben calculated. Robert will send a vehicle immediately. But noon came and went with no sign of rescue. Then afternoon. Then evening. That second night, as we huddled around a small camp stove preparing instant soup from emergency supplies, Ben's calm professionalism began showing cracks of genuine concern. Something's not right, he admitted, as we watched the sun disappear behind distant hills. Even if the Rangers were delayed, Robert would have sent a search party by now. Ruth had fallen quiet, the excitement of the previous day replaced by growing anxiety. She was 23 years old, on her first major field research expedition, and the reality of our situation was beginning to sink in. It was during our third night at the monitoring station that everything changed. I was trying to sleep on a thin camp mattress when I heard the distant sound that would alter the course of my life forever. At first, I thought it might be aircraft from one of the nearby military bases, but as the sound grew closer, I recognized the distinctive thrum of a helicopter's rotors cutting through the night air. I bolted upright, my heart racing with relief and confusion. Who would be flying a helicopter at night in this remote area? As the sound grew closer, I could see lights approaching through the darkness, and my confusion deepened into something approaching disbelief. The helicopter that landed in the clearing beside our monitoring station bore the distinctive logo of Wild Hearts Conservation Foundation. My logo. My helicopter. Captain James Mwangi, whom everyone called Kibo, emerged from the pilot's seat with the kind of grim expression I'd learned to associate with emergency rescues. Behind him came Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the chairman of my foundation's board of directors, and 2 other people I didn't immediately recognize in the darkness. Maya, Kibo called out as I stumbled from the shelter. Thank God you're safe. What are you doing here? I asked, my mind struggling to process this impossible rescue. How did you even know where to find us? Dr. Harper's expression was somber as she approached. We need to talk, she said quietly. There's been a development. The 2 people I hadn't recognized stepped into the light cast by the helicopter's floods, and my world shifted permanently off its axis. The first was Nicole Rodriguez, my closest friend since law school, and the attorney who had helped me establish Wild Hearts as a legal entity. The second was a woman I'd never seen before, probably in her late 20s, strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair, and the kind of camera equipment that marked her as a professional photographer. Maya, Nicole said, her voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. We have something you need to see. Dr. Harper handed me a tablet, its screen glowing in the darkness of the African night. What I saw there made my legs give out, forcing me to sit heavily on a supply crate that had been unloaded from the helicopter. It was Derek's Instagram account, which I rarely looked at since he mostly posted boring legal conference photos and occasional family pictures. But the latest posts were different. They showed him at what was clearly an expensive resort, drinks in hand, smiling broadly at the camera. The location tag read, Fairmont Mount Kenya Safari Club. The photos were time-stamped from yesterday. The same day he thought I was safely stranded in the wilderness with no way to communicate. But it was the woman in the photos that made my blood turn to ice. The same beautiful photographer who had arrived with my rescue team was featured prominently in Derek's posts, clearly comfortable with him in ways that suggested a relationship far beyond professional. The captions were even worse. Finally free to be ourselves, read one. Sometimes you have to create your own opportunities, read another. But the image that destroyed what remained of my 15-year marriage was a close-up of two hands wearing matching rings. Derek's wedding ring, which I'd assumed was safely on his finger, and an identical ring on the woman's hand. The caption read, When you know, you know. Some love stories are worth waiting for. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Derek wasn't worried about my safety. He wasn't pacing our tent, waiting for my return. He was celebrating what he thought was my permanent disappearance with another woman, posting about it publicly like it was some kind of victory. Her name is Zara Mitchell, Nicole said quietly. She's a wildlife photographer who's been working with Derek's firm for the past 8 months, supposedly documenting their environmental projects. Dr. Harper took the tablet back gently. Maya, there's more. The satellite phone at your monitoring station didn't malfunction. Someone disabled the GPS tracking and communication systems remotely. Someone who knew exactly where you were going and when. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Derek's sudden enthusiasm for my research expedition. His insistence that I join the team despite his earlier protests about working during our vacation. His unusual affection and repeated declarations of love the night before I left. He hadn't just abandoned me. He had orchestrated my isolation, planning for me to spend days or possibly weeks stranded in one of Kenya's most remote locations, while he established his new life with Zara. How did you find me? I whispered. Kibo stepped forward, his expression grim. Robert called us yesterday morning when your team didn't return. But when we tried to reach Derek to coordinate a search, we discovered he'd checked out of Acacia Ridge the same day you left for the monitoring station. His Range Rover was gone. The lodge staff said he claimed there was a family emergency. We started investigating, Dr. Harper continued. Nicole had been suspicious about some of Derek's recent behavior. When we saw his social media posts, we knew we needed to get you out of here immediately. I looked around at the faces surrounding me in the helicopter's harsh lights. My professional team, my closest friend, and the woman who had apparently stolen my husband while planning to leave me for dead in the African wilderness. Why is she here? I asked, gesturing toward Zara. Nicole's smile was cold. Because she's about to help us understand exactly how far your husband was willing to go to get rid of you. As we prepared to board the helicopter that would take me back to civilization, I realized that Derek had kept his promise after all. This anniversary trip was indeed going to change everything about our marriage. He just hadn't counted on Wild Hearts Conservation Foundation being better at rescues than he was at abandonment. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a night of profound revelation. I woke in Nicole's guest room at dawn, my mind already racing with strategic possibilities. The emotional devastation of the previous day had crystallized into something more powerful and infinitely more dangerous: methodical planning. While Nicole prepared breakfast, I sat at her dining room table with my laptop, surrounded by the evidence we'd compiled the night before. But now I wasn't looking at Derek's betrayal as a victim processing trauma. I was studying it as a conservation strategist who had spent 15 years outmaneuvering poachers, corrupt officials, and international trafficking networks. Derek had made a critical error in underestimating exactly who he was dealing with. My phone continued to buzz with his increasingly frantic messages. The overnight silence had clearly unnerved him, and his texts were becoming more revealing with each passing hour. Maya, I don't understand why you're not responding. Robert told me you were rescued safely. Please just let me know you're okay. I'm driving back to Nairobi now. Whatever happened out there, we can work through it together. I love you. I know I haven't been the best husband lately, but we can fix this. Please come home. Each message provided valuable intelligence about Derek's mental state and strategic position. He was operating from a place of uncertainty, not knowing exactly what I'd discovered or who I might have spoken to. That uncertainty was an advantage I intended to preserve and exploit. Nicole emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and settled across from me at the table. You look different this morning, she observed, more focused. I've been thinking about Derek's vulnerabilities, I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. He's spent months planning my destruction, but he's made assumptions about my capabilities that are about to prove very costly. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing a systematic analysis of Derek's professional and personal weaknesses. The exercise reminded me of the threat assessments we conducted at Wild Hearts when dealing with organized poaching networks. Every target had pressure points, and Derek was no exception. First vulnerability, I said, thinking out loud as I typed, Derek's law firm. He's positioned himself as an environmental law specialist, but his recent behavior directly contradicts everything the firm claims to stand for. I pulled up the website for Mackenzie and Associates, Derek's prestigious law firm that specialized in environmental legislation and conservation law. Their client list included several major international NGOs, government wildlife agencies, and corporate clients seeking to improve their environmental compliance. The firm's reputation was built on ethical expertise and unimpeachable integrity. Their senior partner, James Mackenzie, is a personal friend of Dr. Harper, I continued. They've served together on several conservation boards. James would be very interested to learn how one of his associates has been misusing nonprofit funds and abandoning conservation professionals in remote locations. Nicole leaned forward, understanding where my thoughts were leading. You're not just thinking about divorce proceedings, you're thinking about destroying his career. Derek's professional reputation is everything to him, I confirmed. It's how he defines himself, how he commands respect, how he maintains his lifestyle. Without it, he becomes just another mediocre attorney with a history of ethical violations. I began researching the regulatory requirements for environmental lawyers in Kenya. The Law Society of Kenya maintained strict ethical standards, particularly for attorneys working with international conservation organizations. Misuse of nonprofit funds, endangering clients, and professional dishonesty were all grounds for suspension or disbarment. But we need more than just the financial evidence, I continued. Derek's too smart to have left a simple paper trail that leads directly to criminal charges. We need to understand his entire network, everyone who's been helping him or turning a blind eye to his activities. Nicole retrieved her own laptop and began pulling up additional resources. I've been thinking about that too. Derek couldn't have organized everything alone. Someone at Acacia Ridge helped him plan your expedition timing. Someone in the conservation community provided him with information about remote monitoring stations. Someone with technical expertise showed him how to disable satellite communications. The insight was brilliant and troubling. Derek's deception had required assistance from multiple people within Kenya's relatively small conservation community. Identifying and exposing those collaborators would not only strengthen our case against Derek, but also protect other conservation professionals from similar sabotage. I started with Robert Nyong'o, the lodge manager who had arranged my research expedition with such convenient timing. Nicole and I spent an hour researching Robert's background, his connections to Derek, and his financial situation. What we discovered was enlightening. Robert had graduated from the same law school as Derek, though several years earlier. They'd maintained contact through alumni networks and had worked together on at least 3 occasions when Derek's firm had represented safari operators in environmental compliance cases. More significantly, Robert's lodge had been facing financial difficulties for the past year, struggling with debt payments and declining bookings. Look at this, Nicole said, pointing to a series of transactions in Robert's business accounts that she'd accessed through her legal research databases. Large cash deposits over the past 6 months, always in amounts just below the threshold for automatic reporting requirements. The deposits coincided perfectly with Derek's increased travel to remote locations throughout Kenya. It appeared that Derek had been paying Robert for information about conservation activities, research schedules, and remote access points. Information that would be invaluable for someone planning to isolate and abandon a conservation professional. Robert's been feeding Derek intelligence about Wild Heart's operations for months, I realized. That's how Derek knew exactly when and where to suggest I participate in research activities. But Robert was just the beginning. Nicole's systematic investigation revealed a network of Derek's contacts throughout Kenya's conservation infrastructure, all of whom had received unexplained payments or unusual favors over the past year. A helicopter pilot who'd been hired for Derek's supposed legal research but had actually transported him to surveillance positions. A communications equipment supplier who'd sold Derek jamming devices under the guise of corporate security testing. Even a clerk at the Kenya Wildlife Service who'd provided Derek with detailed maps of remote research stations and their communication protocols. This is conspiracy, Nicole said, reviewing our findings. Derek hasn't just been cheating and stealing. He's been building a network to facilitate the systematic sabotage of conservation operations. The scope of Derek's activities was staggering and deeply personal. Every aspect of my professional life that I'd shared with him over 15 years of marriage had been cataloged and weaponized. My research interests, my travel patterns, my security protocols, my professional relationships, all turned against me by the person I'd trusted most completely. But the intelligence gathering had also revealed Derek's most critical vulnerability. His entire plan depended on maintaining his reputation within Kenya's conservation community. The same connections that had allowed him to build his sabotage network could be turned against him if the right people learned about his activities. I began drafting a comprehensive communication strategy designed to destroy Derek's standing within the conservation community, while simultaneously protecting Wild Hearts from any retaliatory damage he might attempt. The approach required precise timing and careful coordination with multiple stakeholders, but the Foundation's reputation and resources provided significant advantages. Dr. Harper needs to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, I told Nicole. Not just Wild Hearts board members, but representatives from every major conservation organization in East Africa. I want Derek's activities exposed to the entire community simultaneously. Nicole nodded, understanding the strategic value of widespread exposure. If Derek's crimes become common knowledge across the conservation sector, he won't be able to find employment with any environmental organization on the continent. I continued developing the plan, identifying specific individuals who needed to be contacted and briefed before Derek had any opportunity to spin his own version of events. The Kenya Wildlife Service director, who could investigate Derek's interference with protected area operations. The heads of major international conservation NGOs, who could warn their networks about Derek's tactics. The editors of conservation publications, who could ensure that Derek's activities became part of the public record. But the most important contact was James Mackenzie, Derek's senior partner. I'd met James several times at conservation fundraising events, and he'd always impressed me as someone who took ethical standards seriously. If James learned that one of his associates had been systematically undermining conservation operations while misrepresenting himself as an environmental advocate, the consequences would be swift and severe. I need to call James personally, I decided. Not through official channels, not through written complaints, but a direct conversation where I can present the evidence and let him draw his own conclusions. Nicole was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Maya, once you make that call, there's no going back. Derek will know that you're actively working to destroy him, and he might become desperate enough to attempt more serious retaliation. She was right, but I'd already considered that possibility. Derek's access to Wild Hearts resources was about to be terminated, his professional network was about to be exposed, and his financial assets were about to be frozen. Desperation was inevitable, but desperation also led to mistakes that would provide additional evidence of his criminal behavior. Let him become desperate, I replied. Desperate people make poor decisions, and Derek's poor decisions will just give us more ammunition. I spent the next 2 hours crafting a detailed presentation that would accompany my conversation with James Mackenzie. The document included financial records showing Derek's theft from Wild Hearts, timeline evidence of his sabotage activities, documentation of his network of collaborators, and photographic evidence of his affair with Zara Mitchell. But most importantly, it included a comprehensive analysis of how Derek's activities had potentially endangered conservation operations throughout Kenya. This isn't just about personal betrayal, I explained to Nicole as I refined the presentation. Derek's actions have compromised the safety and effectiveness of conservation professionals across the region. James needs to understand that this is a professional threat to everything his firm claims to represent. While I worked on the presentation, Nicole coordinated with Dr. Harper to arrange the emergency board meeting and began reaching out to her own contacts within Kenya's legal community. By noon, we had confirmations from representatives of 8 major conservation organizations, all of whom would be present for Derek's exposure. There's one more thing we need to consider, Nicole said as we finalized our preparations. Zara Mitchell. She's been an active participant in Derek's schemes, and she has professional connections throughout the wildlife photography community. We can't let her disappear or destroy evidence. I'd been so focused on Derek that I'd almost forgotten about Zara's role in the conspiracy. She wasn't just a passive recipient of Derek's affections. She'd been actively documenting his activities and spending foundation money to do it. Her photography equipment could contain evidence of Derek's entire network, and her professional contacts might include other individuals who'd been compromised or recruited. Do we know where she is right now? I asked. Nicole consulted her phone where she'd been tracking social media activity throughout the morning. Still at the Fairmont Mount Kenya Safari Club, based on her Instagram posts. She's been uploading photos from their spa and posting about a romantic getaway with someone she's calling her, quote, conservation hero. The posts were nauseating in their tone-deaf celebration, but they also provided valuable intelligence. Zara was documenting her location in real time, apparently unaware that her romantic weekend was about to become the centerpiece of a criminal investigation. I'm going to call Captain Wangi, I decided. If Zara has evidence on her photography equipment, we need to secure it before she has a chance to delete or destroy anything. Kibo answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the professional alertness of someone accustomed to emergency calls. Maya, how are you holding up? I'm planning Derek's destruction, I replied without preamble. And I need your help to make sure we get all the evidence before any of his collaborators realize what's happening. I explained the situation to Kibo, including Zara's location and the potential value of her photography equipment. As a former military pilot with extensive experience in complex operations, Kibo immediately understood the strategic requirements. We can have her detained by hotel security within the hour, he said. If she's using professional equipment to document illegal activities, that constitutes evidence that needs to be preserved for investigation. Can you coordinate with Dr. Harper to make it official? I asked. Wild Hearts needs to formally request preservation of evidence related to the theft of foundation funds. While Kibo arranged for Zara's detention and equipment seizure, I made the call I'd been preparing for all morning. James Mackenzie's office put me through immediately. Evidence of the respect that Wild Hearts commanded within the conservation community. Maya, what a pleasure to hear from you, James said warmly. I was just telling Elizabeth Harper last week how impressed I am with Wild Hearts' expansion into Tanzania. James, I'm calling about a serious matter involving one of your associates, I replied, keeping my tone professional despite the emotional weight of what I was about to reveal. Derek Williams has been engaging in activities that compromise both his professional ethics and the safety of conservation operations throughout Kenya. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and complete. James was processing the implications of my words, understanding that I wouldn't make such accusations lightly. What kind of activities? He asked carefully. I walked James through the evidence systematically, starting with the financial theft, and moving through the sabotage, abandonment, and conspiracy elements. I sent him the supporting documentation in real time, allowing him to review the evidence as I explained its significance. "My God," James said when I finished the presentation. "Maya, I had no idea Derek was capable of this kind of behavior. His work with our environmental clients has always seemed exemplary." "That's exactly why his actions are so dangerous," I replied. "Derek has been using his professional reputation and access to facilitate activities that directly undermine conservation efforts. Every conservation professional who trusts him is potentially at risk." James was quiet for several minutes, and I could hear him typing as he reviewed the documentation more thoroughly. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something much colder and more decisive. "Maya, I want you to know that Derek's employment with Mackenzie & Associates is terminated effective immediately. I'm also reporting this matter to the Law Society of Kenya and recommending a full investigation into his professional conduct." The swiftness of James's response was gratifying but not surprising. Environmental law firms couldn't afford to be associated with attorneys who actively undermined conservation efforts. Derek's reputation within the legal community was about to become his greatest liability. "There's one more thing, James," I said. "Derek doesn't know yet that his deception has been exposed. I'd prefer to control the timing of his discovery, so that we can secure all evidence before he has a chance to destroy anything or retaliate against Wild Hearts." James understood immediately. "I'll coordinate with our security team to revoke Derek's access to all firm resources, but we'll make it appear routine until you're ready for full exposure. How much time do you need?" 24 hours, I replied. "Long enough to secure evidence, freeze assets, and ensure that all relevant authorities are properly briefed." As I ended the call with James, Nicole looked up from her own phone with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Kibo just confirmed that Zara Mitchell is in custody at the Fairmont. Hotel security found over 3,000 photos on her equipment, including extensive documentation of Derek's meetings with Robert Nyong'o and other conspirators. The evidence was accumulating faster than I'd anticipated, but Derek remained unaware that his carefully constructed deception was collapsing around him. His text messages to me had continued throughout the morning, each one more desperate than the last. "Maya, I'm back in Nairobi, please call me. I'm going crazy with worry. I went by the house, but you're not there. Where are you staying? I just need to know you're safe. Please don't shut me out. Whatever happened during your rescue, whatever anyone told you, let me explain my side." The final message revealed that Derek was beginning to suspect that his version of events was being questioned, but he still didn't understand the scope of what I'd discovered. That ignorance was about to become his final strategic disadvantage. Nicole and I spent the afternoon coordinating with Dr. Harper to finalize preparations for the emergency board meeting. Representatives from Kenya Wildlife Service, the East African Wildlife Society, Conservation International, and 5 other major organizations had confirmed their attendance. The meeting would serve as Derek's professional execution, carried out by the conservation community he'd spent months betraying. But even as we planned Derek's destruction, I found myself thinking about the future beyond his downfall. Wild Hearts would survive and continue its mission, but the foundation would need new financial controls and security protocols to prevent similar betrayals. I would need to rebuild trust with partners and donors who might question how Derek had been able to operate undetected for so long. Most importantly, I would need to explain to Lily and Sam why their father was about to disappear from their lives in disgrace. They were still in Cape Town with Derek's parents, unaware that their family was about to be destroyed by revelations of criminal behavior and systematic deception. "I should call the kids," I told Nicole as evening approached. "Not yet," she replied firmly. "Derek's parents might warn him if they learn what's happening too early. The children are safe where they are, and they'll be better served by learning the truth from you after Derek can't manipulate the situation." She was right, but the delay felt like another form of betrayal, allowing Derek's deception to continue affecting my children even as we prepared to expose it. The anger that had been building since my rescue intensified into something harder and more focused. Derek had used my love for my children against me, manipulating them into participating in my abandonment while believing they were protecting me from disappointment. He'd stolen money intended to protect endangered wildlife and used it to fund his affair. He'd sabotaged conservation operations and endangered the lives of conservation professionals throughout Kenya. Tomorrow, Derek Williams would discover that his greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my capacity for survival. His greatest mistake had been underestimating my capacity for strategic revenge. As night fell over Nairobi, I reviewed our preparations one final time. Evidence secured, allies briefed, authorities notified, assets frozen, professional networks warned, legal proceedings initiated. Derek's world was about to collapse with the same systematic precision he'd used to plan my destruction. But unlike Derek's plan, mine was designed to succeed. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning at Wildheart's headquarters, but I arrived at 7 to make final preparations. The conference room had been configured to accommodate representatives from 8 major conservation organizations, with Dr. Harper coordinating the technical presentation, while Nicole ensured all legal documentation was properly organized. My phone showed 37 missed calls from Derek overnight, along with increasingly frantic text messages that revealed his growing desperation. The final message, sent at 3 in the morning, was particularly telling. "Maya, I know something's wrong. You've never gone this long without responding to me. Please, whatever you think you know about my trip to Mount Kenya, let me explain. I love you and our family more than anything." The reference to Mount Kenya confirmed that Derek was beginning to understand the scope of his exposure, but his continued attempts at manipulation showed he still believed he could control the narrative. That delusion was about to be permanently shattered. At 8:30, representatives from conservation organizations throughout East Africa began arriving at Wildheart's headquarters. James Mackenzie came personally, accompanied by 2 senior partners and a representative from the Law Society of Kenya. Captain Mwangi brought detailed documentation of Zara Mitchell's arrest and the evidence seized from her photography equipment. Nicole had prepared comprehensive legal briefs for distribution to all attendees, but the most significant presence was Margaret Kimani, Director of Kenya Wildlife Service, whose authority extended over all conservation activities within the country's protected areas. Derek's sabotage of communication equipment at the monitoring station constituted a serious criminal offense under Margaret's jurisdiction, and her participation in the meeting signaled that this was no longer just a civil matter. Before we begin, Dr. Harper announced to the assembled group, "I want everyone to understand that what we're discussing today represents the most serious breach of conservation ethics and criminal activity that any of us have encountered in our professional careers." I took my position at the head of the conference table, looking out at faces I'd known and respected for years. These were the people Derek had been systematically deceiving and potentially endangering through his activities. They deserved to understand not just what he'd done, but how his actions threatened the entire conservation community's ability to operate safely and effectively. Derek Williams has spent the past 8 months constructing an elaborate deception designed to facilitate my abandonment and presumed death in one of Kenya's most remote conservation areas. I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of what I was revealing. But his activities extend far beyond personal betrayal. He's compromised conservation operations, stolen nonprofit funds, and endangered the lives of conservation professionals throughout this region. I walked the group through the evidence systematically, starting with the financial theft and moving through the sabotage network Derek had constructed. Each revelation prompted sharp intakes of breath and increasingly grim expressions from the assembled conservation leaders. When I described Derek's use of Wildheart's funds to pay Zara Mitchell for documenting his affair, Dr. Samuel Ochieng from Conservation International shook his head in disgust. "Maya, this represents a fundamental violation of donor trust. Every conservation organization depends on the integrity of our financial management." Margaret Kimani leaned forward when I explained Derek's sabotage of the satellite communication equipment at Elephant Monitoring Post No. 7. "Ms. Chen, disabling emergency communication systems in protected areas is a federal crime under Kenya's Wildlife Conservation Act. People have died when they couldn't call for help in remote locations." But it was James Mackenzie's response to Derek's network of conservation community collaborators that captured the gravity of the situation most clearly. If Derek has been systematically recruiting conservation professionals to provide intelligence for sabotage operations, James said, reviewing the documentation Nicole had prepared, then he's created a security threat that extends beyond any single organization. Every conservation operation in Kenya could be potentially compromised. The meeting continued for 2 hours as representatives asked detailed questions and coordinated their responses to Derek's activities. By 11 o'clock, we had established a comprehensive plan for Derek's exposure and prosecution that involved every major conservation authority in East Africa. Margaret Kimani would initiate criminal charges related to the communication sabotage and endangerment. James Mackenzie would file formal complaints with the Law Society of Kenya regarding Derek's professional misconduct. Dr. Harper would coordinate with international conservation funders to ensure Derek's activities were reported throughout the global conservation community. Most importantly, all organizations represented would simultaneously release statements warning their networks about Derek's activities, ensuring that he couldn't simply move to another country and continue his destructive behavior. The statements go out at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon, Dr. Harper announced. Coordinated release across all our communication channels, including social media, professional networks, and direct communication with partner organizations. As the meeting concluded, and representatives prepared to return to their organizations, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For 24 hours, I've been operating in crisis response mode, gathering evidence and coordinating strategic responses. Now the machinery of Derek's destruction was in motion, and all that remained was to watch it unfold. Nicole and I returned to her house to monitor Derek's reactions in real time. We'd established monitoring systems to track his communications, social media activity, and financial transactions, allowing us to observe his growing panic as his world systematically collapsed. At 12:15, Derek's law firm sent him a tersely worded email requesting his immediate presence for an urgent matter. The message was copied to James Mackenzie, the managing partner and the head of human resources, indicating that Derek's termination was imminent. At 12:30, Derek attempted to access his Wild Hearts emergency account and discovered that his authorization had been revoked. The automated email notification of the access denial was forwarded to Dr. Harper and our accounting firm, creating an official record of Derek's attempt to access foundation funds after learning of his exposure. At 12:45, Derek received a call from Robert Nyong'o at Acacia Ridge Lodge. We couldn't monitor the conversation directly, but Derek's immediate attempt to book a flight out of Kenya suggested that Robert had warned him about the coordinated investigation into their collaboration. But it was at exactly 2 o'clock that Derek's world truly began to implode. The conservation organizations released their coordinated statements simultaneously across multiple platforms. Within minutes, Derek's name was trending on conservation Twitter feeds, professional LinkedIn networks, and specialized conservation news websites. The statements were factual, comprehensive, and devastating to anyone attempting to work within the conservation community. My phone, which had been mercifully quiet during the morning meetings, suddenly erupted with incoming calls. Derek's name appeared on the screen again and again as he desperately tried to reach me, apparently unaware that I was monitoring his every move. "Maya, please answer the phone," read his first text message after the statements went public. "This is insane. Someone's spreading lies about me across the entire conservation community. I need to explain what really happened." The second message, sent 20 minutes later, showed Derek's growing understanding of his situation. "My law firm just fired me. They're claiming I misused client funds and engaged in criminal activity. This has to be some kind of mistake." The third message revealed Derek's dawning comprehension of the scope of his exposure. "Kenya Wildlife Service just called me. They want to question me about sabotage activities. Maya, what did you tell them? Please call me back. We can work through this together." Nicole and I watched Derek's social media presence disappear in real time as the conservation community reacted to the revelations. His professional LinkedIn profile was flooded with condemnations from colleagues and former clients. His law firm removed his biography from their website and issued a statement distancing themselves from his activities. Conservation organizations that had worked with Derek began posting their own warnings about his deceptive practices. "Look at this," Nicole said, pointing to her laptop screen, where Derek's professional reputation was being systematically dismantled. The East African Conservation Network, just issued a formal alert to all member organizations warning about Derek's sabotage tactics. But the most satisfying development was watching Derek's carefully constructed network of collaborators distance themselves from him as quickly as possible. Robert Nyong'o issued a statement claiming he'd been deceived about the nature of Derek's research activities. The helicopter pilot who'd transported Derek to surveillance positions suddenly couldn't remember any specific details about their arrangements. The equipment supplier who'd sold Derek the communication jamming devices claimed the sale had been misrepresented as legitimate corporate security testing. Derek's network was abandoning him with the same strategic calculation he'd used to plan my abandonment, except his former collaborators were motivated by self-preservation rather than malicious planning. At 3 o'clock, Derek's desperate phone calls were supplemented by voicemails that provided insight into his deteriorating mental state. "Maya, this is insane," his voice said through my phone speaker. "Someone's orchestrated a campaign to destroy my career based on lies and misunderstandings. You know me better than anyone. You know I would never do the things they're claiming." The second voicemail, left an hour later, showed Derek's growing awareness that his denials weren't working. "I don't understand how this happened so fast. Every conservation organization in Kenya is treating me like a criminal. My bank accounts are frozen. The police want to question me. Please, Maya, just call me back so I can explain." But it was the third voicemail that revealed Derek's first hint of understanding about who was orchestrating his destruction. "Maya, I just realized you haven't responded to any of my calls since your rescue. Did someone tell you something about my trip to Mount Kenya? Whatever you think you know, there's context you're missing. I can explain everything if you'll just give me a chance." Nicole and I exchanged glances as Derek's voice played through the speaker. His desperation was becoming palpable, but he still believed he could manipulate his way out of the situation if he could just reach me directly. "He's starting to understand," Nicole observed, "but he still thinks this is about the affair with Zara. He doesn't realize we have evidence of the entire conspiracy." At 4 o'clock, Derek's situation became exponentially worse when Kenya Wildlife Service issued a warrant for his arrest on charges related to sabotaging communication equipment in protected areas. The warrant was accompanied by a press release detailing the serious nature of Derek's alleged crimes and their potential impact on conservation operations throughout the region. Derek's phone calls to me stopped abruptly after the arrest warrant was issued, but his text messages continued with increasing desperation. "Maya, they're trying to arrest me. This is insane. I'm at the airport trying to leave the country, but they've flagged my passport. Please, I'm begging you, call me back. Whatever you think I've done, we can fix it." The image of Derek trapped at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, surrounded by evidence of his crimes and unable to escape the consequences of his actions, provided a satisfaction I hadn't expected. For 3 days, I'd been the one trapped and isolated while Derek celebrated his freedom. Now our positions were permanently reversed. At 5 o'clock, Dr. Harper called with an update that confirmed Derek's complete professional destruction. "Maya, I just spoke with Margaret Kimani. Derek's been taken into custody at the airport. They found evidence on his laptop of the entire sabotage network, including detailed plans for isolating and abandoning conservation professionals in remote locations." The revelation that Derek had documented his own criminal conspiracy was almost too perfect to believe, but it made sense given his legal background. He'd probably created detailed records to protect himself from potential betrayal by his collaborators, never imagining that those same records would become evidence of his guilt. But Dr. Harper had more news. Margaret also told me that Zara Mitchell has been cooperating with investigators. "Apparently, Derek convinced her that you were mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to conservation operations. She believed she was helping Kuwait to protect the conservation community from someone who'd become a liability." The information provided insight into Derek's manipulation tactics and Zara's motivations, but it also revealed the depth of Derek's deception. He'd convinced his collaborators that I was the threat, that my removal was necessary for the greater good of conservation work. It was a masterful psychological manipulation that had allowed him to recruit assistance for what his collaborators believed was a legitimate protective action. As evening approached, Nicole and I prepared for the confrontation I'd been anticipating since Derek's arrest. He would undoubtedly attempt to contact me from custody, probably through his attorney or bail arrangements. I needed to be ready to face him directly without giving him any opportunity to manipulate the situation or gain sympathy through emotional appeals. At 6:30, my phone rang with a call from Nairobi Central Police Station. Derek had been granted one phone call, and he'd chosen to use it reaching me rather than contacting an attorney. "Maya," Derek's voice sounded hollow and defeated when I answered. "Thank God you picked up. This is all some terrible misunderstanding. Someone's convinced the authorities that I'm some kind of criminal mastermind, but you know that's not who I am." "I know exactly who you are, Derek," I replied, my voice calm and controlled. "I know about the stolen foundation money. I know about your network of collaborators. I know about your plan to abandon me in the wilderness. I know about everything." The silence on Derek's end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, losing the desperate pleading tone and revealing something much colder underneath. "You orchestrated this," he said quietly. "The rescue, the investigation, the coordinated destruction of my career. You planned all of it." "I learned from the best," I replied. "You taught me that careful planning and systematic execution can destroy someone's entire life in a matter of hours. The difference is that your plan was based on criminal activity and deception. Mine is based on evidence and justice." Derek's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Justice? Maya, you've destroyed 15 years of marriage and my entire professional reputation because you can't handle the fact that I fell in love with someone else." "I destroyed nothing, Derek. I simply documented what you had already done and shared that documentation with people who had a right to know about it. Your marriage, your career, your reputation, you destroyed all of that yourself through your own choices and actions." "The foundation will never recover from this scandal," Derek said, and I could hear the vindictive satisfaction in his voice. "Major donors don't want to be associated with organizations involved in criminal investigations. You've probably destroyed Wild Hearts, along with everything else." "Wild Hearts will be stronger than ever," I replied confidently. "Donors and partners respect organizations that hold their leadership accountable and take swift action against criminal activity. By exposing your crimes, we've demonstrated exactly the kind of ethical standards that conservation supporters want to see." Derek was quiet again, apparently processing the reality that his final attempt at manipulation had failed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard from him before, something approaching genuine defeat. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you face the consequences of your actions," I replied. "Criminal prosecution, professional sanctions, and complete exclusion from the conservation community you spent months betraying. You'll probably spend several years in prison, and when you're released, you'll discover that your reputation has been permanently destroyed." "And us? Our family?" "There is no us, Derek. There hasn't been for months, probably longer. You made that decision when you chose to steal from my foundation, endanger my life, and celebrate what you thought was my death with another woman." "What about Lily and Sam?" The question about our children was the first thing Derek had said that carried genuine emotion rather than calculated manipulation. Despite everything he'd done, Derek did love our children, and losing them would be the most devastating consequence of his actions. "Lily and Sam will learn the truth about their father's criminal behavior," I said. "They'll understand why their family fell apart and why their father is no longer part of their lives. But they'll also learn that people can survive betrayal and rebuild their lives stronger than before." "Maya, please." Derek's voice broke slightly. "Whatever you think of me, don't take my children away. They're the only good thing I've ever done." "You took them away from yourself," I replied firmly. "Every choice you made, every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every law you broke, all of it led to this moment. Your children deserve better than a father who builds his happiness on the destruction of others." The line went quiet, and I could hear voices in the background as Derek's phone time was apparently ending. When he spoke again, his words carried a finality that suggested he understood his situation was irreversible. "I want you to know that I did love you once," he said quietly. "Before everything went wrong, before I became someone I don't recognize, I really did love you." "I know," I replied, "but love without respect, loyalty, and basic human decency isn't worth anything." And that's all you had left to offer. The call ended and I sat in Nicole's living room feeling something I hadn't expected. Peace. For 15 years, I'd built my identity around being Derek's wife and partner. For 24 hours, I'd been consumed with the process of destroying him. Now, for the first time in months, I was simply Maya Chen, conservation biologist and foundation director, with a clear path forward and unlimited possibilities. Derek Williams was about to discover that his greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my capacity for survival or strategic planning. His greatest miscalculation had been believing that destroying me would somehow improve his own life. Instead, his attempt to eliminate me had revealed his true character to everyone who mattered, destroyed his professional reputation, ended his criminal career, and left him facing years in prison. Meanwhile, I was free to rebuild Wild Hearts into an even more powerful force for conservation, surrounded by people who had proven their loyalty and support when it mattered most. Derek had been right about one thing. His gift had indeed blown my mind. Just not in the way he'd intended. 6 months after Derek's arrest, I stood on the observation deck at Wild Heart's new research facility, watching our helicopter return from another successful anti-poaching mission. The aircraft touched down with the precision that had made Captain Mwangi legendary throughout East Africa's conservation community, and I felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing our operations were saving lives every single day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the expanded compound that now housed 3 times as many vehicles, twice as much equipment, and a staff that had grown from 12 to 37 dedicated conservation professionals. What had once been a modest operation working from converted shipping containers had evolved into East Africa's most sophisticated wildlife protection headquarters, complete with a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, advanced communications center, and research laboratories that attracted scientists from universities around the world. The transformation wasn't just physical. Every person working at the facility carried themselves with a confidence and purpose that had been missing during Derek's subtle undermining. Without his constant questioning of priorities, second-guessing of strategies, and gentle but persistent suggestions that perhaps our work wasn't as important as we believed, the entire team had rediscovered the passion that had originally drawn them to conservation work. Dr. Rachel Kimenju, our new head veterinarian, emerged from the helicopter carrying a small, bandaged elephant calf that had been rescued from a poaching incident near the Tanzanian border. The baby elephant, no more than 6 months old, had survived the attack that killed her mother, and our team had spent 3 days tracking her through dense forest before successfully capturing her for medical treatment and eventual integration into our sanctuary program. "She's going to make it," Dr. Kimenju announced as she carried the calf toward the veterinary clinic, dehydrated and traumatized, but no permanent physical damage. "Give us 2 weeks, and she'll be strong enough to join the other rescued calves in the nursery program." Watching the careful transfer of this vulnerable animal into expert medical care, I felt the familiar surge of purpose that had sustained me through the darkest moments of Derek's betrayal. This was why Wild Hearts existed. This was what Derek's stolen money was supposed to protect. This was the work that his sabotage could have prevented if his plan had succeeded. The foundation had not only survived Derek's criminal activities, but had emerged stronger and more respected than ever before. Major donors had rallied around Wild Hearts when they learned how decisively we'd handled the internal corruption, with several foundations specifically citing our ethical standards and transparency as reasons for increasing their support. The Ford Foundation had approved a 3-year grant worth $2 million. The Gates Foundation had included us in their new African Conservation Initiative. Even the Kenya government had increased our annual operating subsidy by 60%. But perhaps more importantly, conservation organizations throughout Africa had begun modeling their internal oversight procedures on the systems we'd implemented after Derek's exposure. Our transparency protocols, financial monitoring procedures, and ethical guidelines had been adopted by dozens of other foundations, creating industry-wide improvements that would protect countless conservation professionals from similar sabotage in the future. The legal proceedings had concluded 3 weeks earlier, with Derek's sentencing to 8 years in prison on charges including theft, sabotage, conspiracy, and endangerment. The judge had been particularly harsh in her assessment of Derek's character, noting that his betrayal of conservation efforts represented a threat to Kenya's national heritage and international reputation. The defendant exploited his position of trust within the conservation community to facilitate activities that endangered both wildlife and the dedicated professionals working to protect Kenya's natural resources, Judge Wanjiku Ngigi had said during sentencing. His actions demonstrate a callous disregard for the very values he claimed to represent throughout his career. Derek's network of collaborators had received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation, but all had been permanently banned from working in conservation-related fields. Robert Nyong'o had lost his lodge and been deported to South Africa, where he faced additional charges for his role in the conspiracy. The helicopter pilot who had assisted Derek's surveillance activities had lost his commercial license and would never fly professionally again. The equipment supplier who had sold Derek the communication jamming devices faced both criminal charges and civil lawsuits from conservation organizations that had been affected by his products. Zara Mitchell had avoided criminal prosecution by providing crucial evidence against Derek, but her career as a wildlife photographer was effectively over. The conservation community had a long memory for betrayal, and her name had become synonymous with unethical conduct throughout professional networks across 3 continents. Several wildlife photography competitions had retroactively disqualified her previous entries, and major conservation magazines had issued statements distancing themselves from her work. The financial recovery had exceeded even Nicole's optimistic projections. Wild Hearts had not only recovered every dollar Derek had stolen, but had received additional compensation through insurance claims and legal settlements. More significantly, the publicity surrounding our ethical response to internal corruption had attracted new donors who specifically wanted to support organizations that demonstrated moral courage and operational transparency. "You've turned Derek's betrayal into the Foundation's greatest fundraising success," Dr. Harper had observed during our most recent board meeting. "Donors want to support organizations that they can trust completely, and your response to Derek's crimes has established Wild Hearts as the gold standard for conservation ethics." The respect we'd earned within the conservation community had opened doors that would have remained closed for decades under normal circumstances. The United Nations Environment Program had appointed me to their advisory committee on wildlife trafficking, a position typically reserved for conservation professionals with 25 years of experience. The International Union for Conservation of Nature had invited me to chair their elephant specialist group, making me the youngest person ever to hold that position. But the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Margaret Kimani, the Kenya Wildlife Service Director who had led Derek's prosecution, had offered me a position as Deputy Director with responsibility for anti-poaching operations throughout the country. The role would give me authority over conservation law enforcement across Kenya's entire protected area network, a level of influence I'd never imagined achieving. "Your response to Derek's sabotage showed exactly the kind of leadership Kenya needs," Margaret had explained during our meeting about the position. "Someone who can identify threats, build coalitions, and execute strategic responses without getting caught up in politics or personal agendas. We need leaders who understand that conservation is too important to be undermined by individual ambitions or personal grievances." I'd accepted the appointment, which would begin after Wild Hearts completed its current expansion projects. The transition would allow me to maintain my connection to the Foundation while taking on broader responsibilities for conservation throughout Kenya. More importantly, it would position me to prevent the kind of systematic sabotage Derek had attempted, protecting other conservation professionals from similar threats. The investigation into Derek's activities had revealed that his sabotage network was more extensive than we'd initially discovered. His corruption had affected conservation operations in Tanzania, Uganda, and even South Africa, where his legal connections had provided access to sensitive information about anti-poaching strategies. The evidence found on Zara's photography equipment had led to arrests and prosecutions across 4 countries, dismantling an entire infrastructure of conservation sabotage that had been operating for years. Derek wasn't working alone. Margaret had explained during one of our briefings about the expanded investigation. His legal expertise and conservation connections made him valuable to organized poaching networks that wanted intelligence about anti-poaching operations. He was selling information about patrol schedules, communication protocols, and research activities to criminal organizations throughout East Africa. The revelation that Derek's betrayal extended far beyond our personal relationship had been both shocking and oddly comforting. His actions weren't just about our marriage or his affair with Zara. He'd been operating as part of a criminal network that threatened conservation efforts throughout the region. Exposing him had protected not just wild hearts but countless other conservation professionals who would have been endangered by his continued activities. Lily and Sam had returned from Cape Town 2 months after Derek's arrest, and the process of explaining their father's crimes had been the most difficult challenge I'd faced during the entire ordeal. At 16 and 14, they were old enough to understand the severity of Derek's actions, but still young enough to feel profound confusion about how the father they'd loved could have been capable of such calculated cruelty. The initial conversation had taken place in our living room on a quiet Sunday evening, with Nicole present to provide support and answer legal questions that might arise. I'd prepared a careful explanation that acknowledged Derek's crimes without unnecessarily damaging the children's memories of their father during happier times. "Your dad has been charged with very serious crimes," I'd begun, watching their faces carefully for signs of emotional overload. "He stole money from wild hearts, sabotaged conservation operations, and deliberately put my life in danger during our anniversary trip." Lily's immediate response had been denial. "That's impossible. Dad loves you. He loves our family. He would never do anything to hurt you." But Sam, always more analytically minded, had asked the question that revealed his growing understanding of the situation. "Is that why he didn't come back to look for you when you didn't return from the research station?" The conversation had continued for hours, with both children asking detailed questions about Derek's activities, his motivations, and the evidence against him. I'd shown them selected documentation that proved Derek's guilt without exposing them to the most disturbing details of his betrayal. The financial records, the communication sabotage, the network of collaborators, all presented in terms they could understand without traumatizing them unnecessarily. "I keep thinking about that last morning," Lily had said during one of our many subsequent conversations about Derek's betrayal. "How he hugged us extra long and kept taking pictures. He knew he was planning to leave you stranded in the wilderness, and he was still pretending to be this loving husband and father." Sam's processing had been different but equally heartbreaking. "Did he ever really love us?" he'd asked one evening as we sat together in our Nairobi home. "Or was that all fake too?" Those questions had required careful, honest answers that acknowledged the complexity of Derek's character without excusing his actions. Yes, Derek had genuinely loved his children, but that love had coexisted with his willingness to use them as tools in his deception. Yes, Derek had been a devoted father for many years, but he'd also been capable of criminal behavior that could have left them orphaned if his plan had succeeded. The children's healing had been gradual but genuine, supported by professional counseling and the unwavering support of friends and extended family who had rallied around us after Derek's exposure. Dr. Harper had become an honorary grandmother figure, taking special interest in the children's education and emotional well-being. She'd established college funds for both Lily and Sam, ensuring they would have educational opportunities regardless of any financial consequences from Derek's criminal activities. Nicole had evolved from my closest friend into something approaching a sister, providing legal guidance, emotional support, and practical assistance as I navigated single parenthood while rebuilding the foundation. She'd moved her legal practice into an office near Wild Heart's headquarters, allowing her to provide ongoing support while maintaining her own professional independence. "Maya, you're not the same person who called me crying after Derek criticized your work schedule," Nicole had observed recently during one of our weekly check-ins. "You've discovered strengths you never knew you had, and you're using them to accomplish things that would have been impossible when you were constantly second-guessing yourself." Her insight was remarkably accurate. Derek's systematic undermining had indeed made me smaller, more hesitant, constantly seeking validation for decisions I was perfectly capable of making independently. Without his voice questioning my priorities, criticizing my appearance, or suggesting that my passion for conservation was somehow excessive, I'd rediscovered confidence I hadn't felt since my early 20s. Most surprisingly, the crisis had strengthened my relationship with both children in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without Derek's subtle manipulation creating friction between us, Lily and Sam had begun to see me as a complete person rather than just their mother. They showed genuine interest in my work, often spending weekends at the research facility and participating in conservation activities that gave them a sense of purpose beyond their family trauma. "Mom, you're different now," Lily had observed recently, as we worked together on a presentation about elephant communication for her school's science fair. "Stronger, I guess. Like you're not apologizing for taking up space anymore." Her insight was remarkably perceptive and had prompted me to reflect on how profoundly Derek's psychological manipulation had affected my self-perception. For years, I'd been unconsciously minimizing my achievements, downplaying my expertise, and deferring to Derek's judgment, even in areas where I had superior knowledge and experience. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Rebuilding confidence after systematic psychological manipulation required conscious effort and constant vigilance against ingrained patterns of self-doubt. Dr. Sarah Mwangi, the therapist who'd been working with our family, had helped me understand the subtle ways Derek's manipulation had operated and develop strategies for recognizing and rejecting similar behavior in future relationships. Emotional abuse is particularly insidious because it makes you complicit in your own diminishment, Dr. Mwangi had explained during one of our sessions. Derek convinced you that accepting his criticism and deferring to his judgment was evidence of your love and commitment. Learning to trust your own instincts again requires conscious practice and patience with yourself. The professional recognition that followed Derek's exposure had been both gratifying and overwhelming. Conservation organizations throughout Africa had nominated me for leadership positions that acknowledged both my technical expertise and my demonstration of ethical courage under pressure. The African Wildlife Foundation had appointed me to their board of directors. The World Wildlife Fund had invited me to lead their new anti-poaching initiative for East Africa. Each new opportunity represented not just professional advancement, but vindication of the capabilities Derek had spent years undermining. The conservation community's response to his crimes had revealed that my professional reputation was entirely independent of his opinions and manipulations. The respect I'd earned was based on my own accomplishments, not my association with Derek's legal expertise. The most meaningful recognition had come from unexpected sources. Graduate students at universities throughout Kenya had begun citing my response to Derek's sabotage as a case study in ethical leadership and crisis management. Several conservation organizations had implemented new oversight procedures, specifically designed to prevent the kind of internal corruption Derek had perpetrated. "You've changed how the entire conservation community thinks about internal security and ethical oversight," Dr. James Mwenda from the University of Nairobi had told me during a recent conference presentation. "Your systematic exposure of Derek's network has forced all of us to examine our own organizations more carefully and implement stronger protections against internal threats." The investigation into Derek's activities had also led to significant improvements in conservation security throughout East Africa. Communication protocols had been upgraded to prevent sabotage. Financial oversight procedures had been strengthened to detect unauthorized transactions. Background checks for conservation professionals had been expanded to include psychological evaluations and reference checks with former colleagues. Derek's crimes have actually made the entire conservation community stronger and more secure, Margaret Kimani had observed during one of our meetings about the Kenya Wildlife Service position. "His betrayal forced us to confront vulnerabilities we didn't know existed and implement protections that will prevent similar incidents in the future." But perhaps the most satisfying consequence of Derek's exposure was watching his carefully constructed professional reputation crumble in real time. Legal authorities in 3 countries had revoked his licenses to practice law. Environmental organizations worldwide had shared his photograph and details of his crimes, ensuring he could never again infiltrate conservation networks. Professional associations had expelled him and published warnings about his activities in their newsletters and journals. Even more devastating to Derek's ego was the systematic removal of his name from every conservation project he'd ever been associated with. Legal documents were amended to remove his signature. Websites were updated to eliminate his biography and photographs. Professional publications retracted articles that had cited his expertise or quoted his opinions. It's like Derek Williams never existed in conservation law, Nicole had observed with satisfaction as we reviewed the comprehensive erasure of Derek's professional identity. His name has been systematically removed from the permanent record of conservation legal work in East Africa. The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly straightforward, given the criminal evidence against Derek and the prenuptial agreement that invalidated his claim to assets in cases of criminal behavior. I'd retained the house, custody of the children, and control of all family investments, while Derek faced the prospect of emerging from prison with nothing but the debt from his legal defense. The financial implications extended beyond our personal assets. Derek's law firm had been forced to pay substantial damages to Wild Hearts for his theft of foundation funds. His professional insurance policy had been voided due to criminal conduct, leaving him personally liable for all legal costs and civil judgments. Several of his former clients had filed malpractice suits, claiming his criminal activities had compromised their legal representation. Derek will spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes, Nicole had explained as we reviewed the final divorce decree. Even after he's released from prison, he'll face years of financial obligations that will prevent him from rebuilding any kind of comfortable lifestyle. More satisfying than the financial resolution was the knowledge that Derek's professional reputation was permanently destroyed. Even if Derek served his full sentence and attempted to rebuild his life, he would be forever marked as someone who had betrayed the conservation community's trust. No environmental organization would hire him. No conservation project would accept his participation. No legitimate legal firm would associate with his damaged reputation. The children's relationship with Derek remained complicated but manageable. They'd visited him twice since his incarceration, meetings that had been emotionally difficult but necessary for their healing process. Derek had used both visits to express genuine remorse for his actions and their impact on his family, but he'd also attempted to minimize his responsibility and suggest that his isolation in prison was somehow excessive punishment. "He keeps saying he made mistakes," Sam had reported after the second visit. "But they weren't mistakes, were they? He planned everything carefully for months." "No, sweetheart," I'd confirmed. "Your father made deliberate choices to prioritize his own desires over everyone else's safety and well-being. That's not a mistake. That's a character flaw that led to criminal behavior." The visits had become less frequent as both children processed their feelings about Derek's crimes and their own need for emotional distance from his continued manipulation attempts. Lily had decided to stop visiting entirely after Derek had spent their last meeting trying to convince her that I was somehow responsible for his legal troubles. "He's still trying to make us choose sides," she'd explained to Dr. Mwangi during a family therapy session. "He doesn't understand that we already chose. We chose Mom because she never lied to us or used us to hurt other people." Sam continued visiting Derek occasionally, but always with clear boundaries about acceptable conversation topics and strict time limits to prevent emotional manipulation. His relationship with his father had evolved into something approaching forgiveness without requiring reconciliation or ongoing emotional connection. "I can forgive Dad for making terrible choices," Sam had explained to me recently. "But I don't have to pretend those choices didn't reveal who he really is. And I don't want to be anything like him." As I watched the helicopter crew unload equipment from their latest mission, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed since that anniversary trip that was supposed to rekindle my marriage. The woman who had trusted Derek's promises and ignored her own instincts felt like someone from a different lifetime. The person I'd become was more cautious about whom to trust, but also more confident in my own judgment and capabilities. The research facility's expansion had created opportunities to mentor young conservation professionals in ways that reminded me why I'd originally chosen this career path. Dr. Kimenju represented one of dozens of talented scientists who had joined Wild Hearts specifically because of our reputation for ethical leadership and meaningful work. Our internship program now attracted graduate students from universities throughout Africa and beyond, providing them with hands-on experience and conservation techniques that would shape their careers for decades. "Working at Wild Hearts feels different from other conservation organizations," one recent intern had told me during his exit interview. Everyone here seems genuinely committed to the mission without any hidden agendas or personal politics. You can focus entirely on protecting wildlife without worrying about internal conflicts or competing priorities. His observation captured something essential about the culture we'd built at Wild Hearts. A workplace environment where ethical behavior was expected rather than exceptional, and where conservation goals took priority over individual advancement or recognition. Derek's removal had eliminated the subtle toxicity that had been undermining staff morale and operational effectiveness for months. The Foundation's headquarters now displayed a wall of photographs documenting our conservation successes over the past 6 months. Rescued elephants thriving in protected habitats. Arrested poachers being led away in handcuffs. Community education programs teaching children about wildlife protection. Graduate students conducting research that would inform conservation strategies for decades to come. Each image represented work that Derek's sabotage could have prevented if his plan had succeeded. But perhaps the most meaningful photograph was one Dr. Harper had commissioned for the anniversary of Derek's exposure. It showed the entire Wild Hearts team gathered around our helicopter, with Captain Mwangi at the center and our rescued elephants visible in the background. Everyone in the image was smiling genuinely, radiating the satisfaction that came from meaningful work accomplished with integrity and mutual respect. This is what conservation looks like when it's not being undermined from within, Dr. Harper had said when she'd presented the photograph to the team. This is what we can accomplish when everyone involved is truly committed to the mission. The image had become iconic within Kenya's conservation community, shared widely on social media and used in presentations about ethical conservation practices. But for me, it represented something much more personal. Proof that Derek's attempt to destroy me had actually freed me to become more effective and fulfilled than I'd ever been during our marriage. My phone buzzed with a text message from Lily, who was spending the afternoon studying at our house in Karen. "Mom, I just finished reading that article about your UN appointment. I'm proud of you. Dad never understood what you were capable of accomplishing." The insight from my 16-year-old daughter captured something profound about Derek's fundamental mistake. He'd seen my dedication to conservation as competition for his attention, rather than recognizing it as the expression of capabilities that could benefit everyone in our family. His need to diminish me had prevented him from understanding that supporting my success would have strengthened our entire family unit. Now, surrounded by people who genuinely respected and supported my work, I was accomplishing things that would have been impossible under Derek's subtle but constant undermining. The UN appointment would allow me to influence conservation policy on a global scale. The Kenya Wildlife Service position would give me authority over anti-poaching operations throughout one of Africa's most important wildlife habitats. The expanded Wild Hearts operations would protect thousands of additional animals each year. All of it had become possible only after Derek's removal from my life had eliminated the psychological barriers he'd systematically constructed. Without his questioning of my priorities, his criticism of my appearance, his suggestions that perhaps I was working too much or caring too little about family obligations, I'd rediscovered the ambition and confidence that had originally driven me to pursue conservation as a career. The evening routine at Wild Hearts had evolved into something approaching a celebration of each day's accomplishments. Staff members gathered in the main conference room to share updates from their various projects, discuss challenges they'd encountered, and coordinate activities for the following day. The atmosphere was collaborative and supportive, with everyone contributing expertise and enthusiasm to problems that required creative solutions. Tomorrow's helicopter mission will focus on the northern corridor, where we've detected increased poaching activity, Captain Mwangi announced as the day's final briefing began. Intelligence suggests at least 3 organized groups operating in the area, possibly coordinated by the same network we disrupted last month. Dr. Kimenju raised her hand to contribute information from the veterinary perspective. We've treated 4 elephants this week with wounds consistent with snare traps. The injuries suggest the poachers are using increasingly sophisticated equipment, probably supplied by external sources. The conversation continued with contributions from researchers, rangers, communications specialists, and administrative staff, each person providing insights that improved our collective understanding of the challenges we faced. The collaborative approach stood in stark contrast to the hierarchical, controlling management style Derek had always preferred in his legal practice. This is how conservation work should function, I reflected as the briefing concluded and staff members began preparing to leave for the day. Everyone contributing their expertise without worrying about personal recognition or internal politics. As evening approached and the research facility prepared to close for the day, I made my final rounds through the buildings that housed Wild Heart's expanding operations. The veterinary clinic, where injured animals received world-class medical care. The communications center, where our helicopter pilots coordinated with rangers throughout East Africa. The education wing, where local community members learned skills that allowed them to benefit economically from wildlife protection rather than poaching. Every aspect of the facility represented work that mattered, accomplishments that would outlast any individual career and contribute to conservation efforts for generations to come. Derek's sabotage could have prevented all of it, leaving Africa's wildlife more vulnerable and conservation professionals more isolated and less effective. But Derek's plan had failed spectacularly, and his failure had become Wild Heart's greatest success story. The publicity surrounding our ethical response to internal corruption had attracted international attention and support that transformed us from a regional conservation organization into a globally recognized leader in wildlife protection. The drive home through Nairobi's evening traffic gave me time to appreciate how completely my life had been transformed. The house that Derek and I had shared was now truly mine, filled with authentic warmth rather than the tension that had characterized our final months together. Lily and Sam were thriving academically and emotionally, pursuing their own interests without having to navigate their father's manipulation or constant criticism of their choices. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own instincts and capabilities in ways that made me a better conservationist, a better mother, and a better person. Derek's betrayal had been devastating, but surviving it had taught me strengths I'd never known I possessed, and revealed professional opportunities I'd never imagined pursuing. When I arrived home, both children were waiting, with dinner prepared and homework completed, evidence of the responsibility and maturity they'd developed in response to our family's crisis. The evening routine we'd established emphasized communication, mutual support, and celebration of individual accomplishments, without the competitive dynamics that had characterized family interactions when Derek was present. "You know what I realized today?" Sam said as we cleared dishes after dinner. "Dad always made everything about him, even our family conversations. Now we actually talk about what everyone's interested in." His observation was astute and healing. Derek's narcissistic tendencies had indeed made every family interaction revolve around his needs, his schedule, his priorities. Without his dominating presence, we'd developed into a family unit that celebrated each person's individual interests and accomplishments, while maintaining strong emotional connections and mutual support. Later that evening, as I reviewed correspondence from conservation organizations around the world seeking advice about ethical oversight procedures, I reflected on the unexpected ways Derek's betrayal had expanded my influence and professional opportunities. The systematic documentation of his crimes had become a template for identifying and preventing similar sabotage in other organizations. Maya, your response to Derek's sabotage has literally changed how conservation organizations think about internal security. Dr. Elizabeth Okonkwo from the African Conservation Foundation had written in a recent email, "We've implemented oversight procedures based on your recommendations, and several other organizations have done the same. You've created industry-wide improvements that will protect conservation professionals for decades to come." The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it represented tangible progress toward preventing other conservation professionals from experiencing the kind of systematic betrayal Derek had perpetrated. If my suffering could protect others from similar sabotage, then Derek's crimes had inadvertently contributed to the broader conservation mission he'd spent months undermining. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with Derek's promise that my anniversary gift would blow my mind. He'd been absolutely right, though not in any way he'd intended. His gift of betrayal and abandonment had indeed blown my mind by revealing capabilities I'd never imagined and opening possibilities I'd never considered. The woman who had trusted Derek's manipulation and ignored her own instincts was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that authentic relationships required mutual respect and genuine support for each other's goals and aspirations. The conservationist who had apologized for her passion and minimized her expertise had evolved into a leader who could influence wildlife protection policies on a global scale. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities in conservation work that mattered more to me than any personal relationship ever could. Lily and Sam would continue growing into remarkable young adults who understood both the cost of betrayal and the value of integrity. Wild Hearts would continue expanding its impact throughout Africa and beyond, protecting wildlife and supporting conservation professionals with ethical leadership and unwavering commitment to our mission. Derek Williams would remain in prison, confronting the consequences of choices that had destroyed his family, his career, and his future. His attempt to eliminate me from his life had instead eliminated him from mine, permanently and completely. The conservation community he'd betrayed would continue its crucial work without his interference, stronger and more secure because of the lessons learned from his crimes. Standing on my bedroom balcony, looking out over the Nairobi skyline toward the conservation areas where tomorrow's work awaited, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: complete confidence in my own judgment and unlimited optimism about the future. The stars above reminded me of that first night at Acacia Ridge, when I'd believed Derek's promises and trusted his affection, unaware that I was sleeping beside someone capable of calculating cruelty and systematic betrayal. Now, 6 months later, those same stars illuminated a completely different reality. I was Maya Chen, conservation biologist, foundation director, and soon-to-be deputy director of Kenya Wildlife Service. I was a woman who could survive wilderness abandonment and orchestrate strategic revenge with equal competence. I was a mother raising children who would never accept manipulation or betrayal as acceptable behavior in relationships. Most importantly, I was free to become whoever I chose to be, without anyone's permission or approval. Derek had been wrong about everything, but especially about me. I wasn't boring, I wasn't dispensable, and I certainly wasn't someone who could be discarded without consequences. His gift had indeed blown my mind, just not in the way he'd planned. And for that unintended favor, I would always be grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.